Okay, hello everyone, it's me, Profesor here, and as you can clearly see, I'm taking advantage of this nicer weather to finally record out here in the backyard. I know some of the early videos that I had for you in the last few weeks were inside because the heat was just awful. I mean, it was temperatures were around the 104, 105. There was a stretch for about 5, 6 days where it was in the hundreds. Once it got down to the mid-90s, there was actually some relief. So things are pretty nice right now, but that's going to change in the next few days. So before the heat comes back, I definitely want to take advantage of it and record this video here for you today. So before I get to the topic, as you can clearly see, I'm definitely getting ready for the season. Of course, the NFL is in full swing and the baseball playoffs are just about to start. And of course, okay, and of course we're going to have some interruption here today. Come on, you silly cat. Okay, yeah, definitely going to have some distractions here, so I'll try to get through this as best as possible before this guy knocks over the camera and also knocks over my MacBook because I've got the information about this week queued up over here. So it's going to be fun, so let's just see what unfolds here. Okay, come on, out of the way. Gato loco. Okay, all right. Okay, well, but in any case, yeah, I'm definitely getting ready for hockey season. So the season's going to start in a couple of weeks, and I'm definitely looking forward to that. Well, let me go ahead and get going. Let me get the topic out of the way before we get some more calamities or catastrophes here. Sorry about that bad pun, but that's an old joke, an old gag, so I couldn't resist using that. Okay, well listen, here we are on the 7th week of the session, and now we're going to get into the 1960s. So it's definitely a pivotal era in the notion of Chicano Mexican American identity, and undoubtedly all of you just worked on the EBSCO paper, so many of the themes that you touched upon are definitely echoed here in what's happening in this week's topics and readings. So let's go ahead and start by looking at one of the earlier readings from beyond 1848. So even though this is one of the earlier readings that ideally you should have done a couple of weeks earlier, I want you to go ahead and take a look at this reading. This is a reading from Rodolfo Alvarez. It's on pages 3 of 26, in which Alvarez essentially gives a really good review of many of the topics that we've looked at so far in the class. And he talks about the idea of the Chicano Generation, which is the period that we're examining this week. And for those of you who did the EBSCO paper on the article by Gutierrez, undoubtedly, the topics that you came across when you read that article are echoed here in the section by Rodolfo Alvarez. So start with that, and that'll give you, you might say, a good review of the events leading up to what we now know as the Chicano Generation. And then once you go ahead and finish with that, then go ahead and check out Chapter 10 from Crucible of Struggle. Vargas gives a great panorama of, you might say, the legendary Chicano icons from the 1960s. And of course, we're talking about people. Okay. Oh, where was I? Yeah, he's really rambunctious today. I think he's happy because the weather has cooled off. He really has a tough time when the heat has set in. All right, but in any case, in Chapter 10 of Crucible of Struggle, Vargas talks about all the key players. Of course, Cesar Chavez, Los Huerta, Reyes Lopez Tijirina, Corky Gonzalez, Jose Angel Gutierrez. Undoubtedly, what Vargas does is he does a great job of, I think, mixing and combining and discussing the trends happening on both a rural framework and an urban framework. In other words, he does a great job of showing that what's happening in the fields in places like Delano, Bakersfield, Wasco, Taft, all those towns in the Central Valley in California, that a lot of the key events that are happening, the key topics and themes, have much relation to what's happening in Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, San Jose, all the other urban zones, Tucson, Dallas. Of course, many of the major cities in the Southwest. So So definitely, after you check out chapter 10 from A Crucible of Struggle, then go ahead now to the next reading from Between the Conquests. I'm sorry, Beyond 1848. This is the reading Slightly Rediscovered by John Chavez. Basically, what Chavez does in that segment is elaborate more upon the topics that Vargas talks about, but I think in a more nationalistic perspective. And one I'll say about this before I finish off and talking about the PowerPoint and the film is that. And I think I discussed this with some of you, whether it was maybe from your introductions or from the discussion topics, the discussion forums. But the differences between the term Mexican American and Chicano, maybe back in those days, the 1960s, 1970s, it was definitely a bit of controversy in terms of what people identified themselves with. I think anyone who is Mexican American generation would say, well, of course, their focus, their loyalties to the United States. These were from the World War II people that. That why should they focus in on what their parents, the earlier generation in the 1920s, this focus on Mexico, and what did Mexico do for you? Here in the United States, we have this, we have that, we have material resources, we have good jobs, a car, house with a lawn, that type of thing. So that, in essence, is the idea, some of the ideology of the Mexican-American generation. But the Chicano generation, as we get into the 1960s, and a lot of the social problems that begin to unfold, and dovetailing with some of the issues which are going along with the African-American civil rights movement, the women's movement, the feminist movement, and also, of course, with the Native American movement. A lot of the issues which are going on in those groups correlated with the sentiment of the younger generation, that is, generation who came after the World War II generation. So the Chicano generation historically has believed, well, why are you interested in what the U.S. has to do for you? Even though we have this job, we haven't gone far. Your boss treats you like dirt, like this and that. What has the U.S. done for you? That type of thing. So that whole argument that it's more of a nationalistic perspective, and this is the context in which guys like Tijerina, Gonzalez, Chavez, and Huerta definitely come into the scene. But since that was the 1960s and into 1970s, I would tend to argue that now in modern times, maybe the differences between the two generations have seemingly been faded or eradicated. So my perspective is that I think if you use the term Mexican American or Chicano, I think in modern times they mean more or less the same. There's a little bit more interchangeability in that. I think there's prime evidence of the fact that, for instance, with here in Southwestern, the classes are Mexican American Studies, but over at City College and at Mesa College, it's Chicano Studies. Of course, people still argue the semantics over that, but I think in modern times the terms essentially mean the same thing. Maybe some of you might agree with that. Maybe some of you disagree with that. But that's my perspective. That's at least the way I see things in this. Day and age. Okay, that was, you might say, my 5 cents, my 10 cents worth to kind of add my perspective to this. So after you finish off with the Chavez reading, then go ahead on with a PowerPoint program, and let's take a look at more United States labor issues, union activities, with the life and times of the legendary labor leader Walter Reuther. Walter Reuther was a native of from the east. He was from West Virginia, actually, but he came to fame as one of the early organizers in Detroit. He helped to organize a lot of the early protests, organizing for the Ford Motor Company in the 1930s. Mr. Ford was no fan of unions back in those days. He had some goons and thugs. They were ridiculously called the service department, but they, let's put it this way: they didn't check your brakes or check your fluids. But when it came to maybe giving you a black eye or busting your kneecap, that's essentially what these guys were all about. So you read a little bit more about the stuff that Mr. Reuther had to deal with in the 1930s, and then when he became the head of United Auto Workers, he fought General Motors in the 1940s after World War II, and by the time we get to the 1950s and 1960s, he was a close ally with Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, and was interested in the organizing activity of Cesar Chavez and the UFW. Basically, Walter Reuther was the first national labor leader who really saw Cesar and the UFW as brothers in arms. They were fighting essentially the same cause. They had the same fight. The UAW gave the UFW a strike fund that lasted for many years. I've seen evidence of the receipts at the Walter Reuther Museum at Wayne State in Detroit. Really fascinating stuff that I've seen there. A lot of notes saying brother Cesar, here is the strike fund. Give my regards to Helen. Say hello to the kids. Brother Walter. That type of thing. The correspondence between Ruther and Chavez. Really fascinating. And I think had it not been for Walter Reuther, who knows how much more attention Cesar would have gotten in the 1960s. But again, the point is that Walter Reuther was a man who recognized Cesar as a fellow Union guy, an organizer who you might say had the same spirit in the 1960s that Walter Reuther had in terms of fighting against Ford and a lot of the other Detroit companies in the 1930s into the 1940s. Basically, their cause was the same cause. Tragically, Walter Reuther died in a plane crash in 1970. And who knows what would have happened with the UFW had things been different. Maybe by Reuther being alive since the 1970s, that would have given Chavez and the UFW much more of a sense of political cover against the increasing conservatism that began to hit the United States with people like Richard Nixon and more so with Ronald Reagan when he became president in 1980, and of course with the governors in California like George Duke Majan and later on Pete Wilson, who of course were no fans of organized labor, and of course Reagan himself. He was governor in the 1960s. He was no fan of Cesar Chavez when the grape strike was going on. All right, after you finish off with the Walter Reuther program, then wrap things up for the week by checking out the film The Struggle in the Fields. The 50-minute component from the Chicano video series. So check that out at the end of the at the end of this week. There's a detailed summary that I have included in the module. So check that out as well. And remember, this is the part of the Chicano series that's required for the class. That's required for the week. But the other 3 installments that are available in the class, those are the ones that you're going to be using for the Chicano video assignments. So every other program, instead of the fight in the fields, the struggle in the fields, watch any of the other 3 for the Chicano video review assignment. Again, it's choose one of those other 3, but the struggle in the fields installment, that's off limits for the assignment. But that's because that's part of the required reading and viewing for this week. Okay, well that's it for this week. Thankfully, we were able to get through the video before Nick did any more damage. Let's go ahead and let him come in and say hello there he is. Let's go and let him say hello and or goodbye for one more time. And so I've got one more video for you guys next week as we get to the final week of the session. So depending on what the weather is like, we'll either come out here for one more time or we'll stay inside. But in any case, I will have at least one more video for you in which we go and wrap up the class. Okay, all right. Looks like Nick wants to say goodbye. Okay, all right, guy. I gotta change shirts. I've got all his fur all over me. All right, so that's it from here. That's it from the French Valley headquarters or the home office. I'm starting to get a bit of a sneezing attack here, so I'll go ahead and wrap things up. And I'll definitely see you guys again next week for the final preview video of the session.